lives, which will make your data management plan easier. And this is a new requirement by NIH. I was hoping Tom would be on here so he could say a little bit about what he found out when he was up there. It seems that most of the institutes are still trying to figure out exactly what they want in a data management plan, but we got to be proactive because it's required. And so I know that, and so I know that they're really wanting everybody to start using lab archives. So we are so lucky that Elizabeth came up with a presentation to help us better understand how to use it. And she said it is so easy. It's just like an online file cabinet. That I can understand. So with that, Meredith, do I need to start recording?
It's already recording.
Oh, yay.
Oh,
okay.
I started it. You're okay. You're good.
Thanks.
In that case, let me share my screen to bring up the presentation. I probably will not see any questions that come through during this presentation, but y'all go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll get through them all at the end.
Okay. I'll keep an eye out too. If there's something comes up, I can kind of interject.
Okay. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Excellent. So welcome to Lab Archives, Best Practices for Notebook Creation and Data Management. This program is sponsored in part by the Lewis Library Department of Digital Scholarship, of which I'm a member. My name is Elizabeth Spear. I am currently the copyright and OER strategist for the library, which means that I handle anything publishing related, and I happen to be the campus Lab Archives administrator. So today we're going to go over a few things. We're going to talk about a little bit about what Lab Archives actually is, why using an ELN is important and useful. I'm going to give you a glossary of terms because Lab Archives does have specific language that it uses repeatedly in all of its training materials. Talk about your account and the correct way to create an account if you don't already have one, because if you don't do it the right way, there can be problems. Some best practices for setting up your notebook, including some requirements that HSC has decided need to happen in every notebook. A little bit about data management, users and sharing permissions within your Lab Archives account, because there are different levels and things that you can do there. And then DOIs and research sharing, because you can actually request a digital object identifier through Lab Archives for your data sets. So what is Lab Archives? Well, hopefully everybody that's here knows a little bit about what Lab Archives is, but it is an electronic lab notebook that allows HSC researchers to store, organize, share, and publish, and I use that term loosely, their research at all stages of the research data lifecycle. So from start to finish, everything can live inside Lab Archives. Think about it, as Dr. Gregory said, as an online file cabinet. The file cabinet itself is the square of Lab Archives. Drawers are notebooks, and then you have folders and subfolders that live inside those drawers or notebooks, and then pages and entries are the processes and results of all of your research. So if you think about how you would file things if everything was paper-based still, it'll help you understand how Lab Archives works a little bit more. So why use an electronic lab notebook? Well, there's a lot of reasons. As you can see on this screen, there are a lot of reasons. But the first and most important one is that it is a required best practice for HSC researchers if you have an NIH grant that started July 1st or later. We do recommend that if you have an NIH grant that began before July 1st, that you go ahead and create a notebook and upload all of your data in there. But the campus has not required it for before, only for things that started July 1st and after. It is recommended for any grant that you are working through with your research, but NIH currently are the only ones that are required. There are a lot of other reasons here that are important, and just to highlight a couple, you can actually create templates for research groups within your lab to ensure consistency in how people are reporting their data. It supports grant compliance requirements, and maybe the most important one that we really don't like to talk about is the continuity and preservation of data from departed researchers and staff, especially if there's ever a question about the validity or the reproducibility of the research that was conducted, to where we might have to go back in and look at how people manage things and what they did, and pull some additional data after they've already left. Lab Archives doesn't delete any information. It is always there. You cannot delete a notebook. You cannot delete a file that you've put into your notebook. So once it's there, even if you tell it to delete it, it just moves it to a deleted items folder, and that folder can never actually be gotten rid of. So we're able to see by request only, access is only granted in a very specific way. But if something comes up about the integrity of research, by using Lab Archives, we actually have a way to go back in and look and see what was done. And then, notebooks store every single version of every file and are timestamped to guard against that kind of misconduct that can, not that it happens often, but occasionally it does. And then you can also create DOIs for sharing and publishing purposes, and it allows us to review those for intellectual property concerns. So a quick glossary of terms, just where everyone is on the same page. An ELN is an electronic lab notebook. A notebook is a collection of folders, subfolders, and pages on a topic, research area, grant, or project. A folder is a collection of pages within the notebook. A subfolder is going to be a folder within that folder. And a page is a collection of files, data, and entries, and it may be included in a folder, or pages can actually stand alone within Lab Archives. And then finally, files, data, and entries are all pieces of information that can only be added to Lab Archives by creating or adding to a page. So if you have an Excel spreadsheet that you need to upload into Lab Archives, first you have to create a page that you have named, and then you can upload that Excel spreadsheet onto that page. You cannot just have an Excel spreadsheet hanging out in Lab Archives, not attached to a page. So information about your account. It is really important that you log in to Lab Archives using our link. There is a way for you to access Lab Archives and tell it that you belong to us by just doing a Google search, but it's easier if you simply bookmark our page that lets you get to that link. We have it available in a couple different places. The first is within the guide that I have created on the library's website that provides all kinds of information about Lab Archives. It explains to you how to access it, how to create a DOI, how to integrate your REDCap data into it. There's all kinds of information in that guide. And the others is on Research's website. They actually have a page that's just for the electronic lab notebook, and it'll give you the correct link to get to Lab Archives. We have had several people that created a free Lab Archives account outside of our system, and then when they went to use ours, it didn't connect the correct email address that they wanted onto their account. It used their secondary email address, which then caused problems with sharing because they didn't understand why it wasn't using the email that they thought it should. So it's really important, if you haven't already set up your Lab Archives account, to do so using this method. When you click on one of the links, you're going to get one of two pages. Hopefully it takes you right here to the SSO that we're all familiar with, but you may see this other one on the left-hand side first, where it tells you it's institutional authentication, and it should default to the University of North Texas Health Science Center, but if it doesn't, you can find it within that drop-down. Then you click Go to Institutions Login. It'll cue the SSO at that point, and that'll get you in correctly. So the first time that you log in, it's going to ask you to create your Lab Archives account. Please, I am begging you, use your unthsc.edu email. If you are having students that are working on your research project with you or in your lab, they need to use their myunthsc.edu domain, not if they were a student at Denton before they came to us, not their myUNT email. They need to use the one associated with HSC for it to connect properly. The company or institution does need to be spelled out. University of North Texas Health Science Center. You cannot abbreviate. You can't put HSC. You can't put UNT HSC. You do have to spell it out for it to correctly attach you to our account. SSO helps with that, but sometimes there are glitches within the system depending on how your email address and your account was set up. And so it's really important that you utilize the right terminology. Once you do that, you will get an email address, an email sent to you at the address that you register with, asking you to verify that you are who you say you are. And when you do that, what I need you to do is you'll log in the first time. And when you do that, your name will appear up at the top so that you know it's your account and you're in. The first time you're in there, I need you to go to manage my account from the drop-down menu that appears under your name and look at the information that is presented on this page. If your email addresses do not match and the email address associated with it, because this first one is populated by whatever SSO tells it, and the second one is the confirmation email that you gave it. If they do not match, and the first one is not grayed out where it's black and it'll allow you to make edits, please change that to where those email addresses match. If it's grayed out, then that email address, whatever's in the first one, is the email address that people will have to send invitations for you to view their research to, because it will default and it'll actually send it to your regular UNTHSC email address. I just don't think that everyone realizes that as employees of the system, we actually have multiple email addresses assigned to us, and they all sort of just route to a single location. So depending on what has happened and how things have occurred within your SSO signup, these may not always be the email address that you expect it to be, but the one that is first is the one that it will default to and everyone needs to send invitations to. Then you need to make sure you've selected that you're a researcher, not an instructor or student. That gives you the correct credentials. And then the biggie, you need to put in your ORCID. If you don't have an ORCID, and I assume all of you do, but a lot of students that work within our labs and work with us on things have not yet established their ORCID. They need to, and there's a reason for this. When you request a DOI for data sets later on, ORCID is a required field for every person that will be listed as an author. And you're going to need that anyway when you go to publish your research other places. So we really need you to put your ORCID into your account. And if students don't have one or you don't have one and you don't know how to get one, please stop by the library. We're actually in the middle of configuring a campus-wide ORCID account so that we can, with permissions from people when they set up their ORCID, we can actually harvest data about how our people are publishing and where they're publishing and provide that to departments and individuals that might need that. So please put your ORCID into your account. So now that setting up your account is all taken care of, there are some best practices for setting up your notebook. And they start actually before you go to create it in Lab Archives. So before you begin in Lab Archives, you need to gather documentation for the HSC required folder. Now, this is probably the first time everybody is hearing about this HSC required folder. Hopefully, those of you with Lab Archives have seen that you have a folder that you didn't create that has been given to everyone. There's information within that campus-wide folder that must be copied and sent to every notebook that is created that has to do with grants from now on. And I will cover what kind of information goes into that folder. You need to determine the type of your notebook. Most of our notebooks are going to be grant-based or project-based. Occasionally, we'll have a lab-based or an individual researcher-based notebook. You need to determine ownership. Who is going to own this notebook? Now, it needs to be the PI. It really does, because if we have questions about the research, we will know who the primary investigator on that grant was because of campus records. So if we go to find that information because for some reason you have left the university, something has happened, we need access to that, that's whose account we're going to look at. And if it's not there, we will have no idea where that research data is stored or who is in charge of it or who has been responsible for uploading things. So the PIs really do need to be the one to create the notebooks. Once you do that, there are ways that you can give some administrative rights to other people to help you manage the upload of data, but you need to be the one that actually creates the notebook. You need to determine who needs access. Every single person that you think is going to have something to do with this research project will need to have access to this. Now, you can always go back later and add additional people, but it's easier if you just know everybody at the beginning to where everyone gets their invitation at the same time. You're also going to need to determine what access level all of those people need. Are they going to be an administrator who has basically all the rights as the notebook owner? Are they going to be a user? Those are people that can't make major changes, but they can upload things. They can read everything. Or are they going to be a guest? And guests only have temporary access to things. They're going to be there in a limited capacity. Users and guests can actually be limited. I'll go through a little more about their things later, but they can be limited to where they can only read things. So if you have someone that you just need to take a look at something and read a section, make them a guest with read-only access. You need to establish and document your file naming conventions. This is really important later on when other people are trying to read and access your research. If they don't understand how you've got things named, it's almost impossible for them to find this information. It's also really important if you request a DOI later on for the people that have to approve that on campus to where they know where to look and how to look at your research. You need to create any glossary or set vocabulary, any special terms, acronyms, etc. that you're going to use. If you're going to refer to all of your researchers by initials, that needs to be in your set vocabulary so that people that come later understand who did what. And then you need to map out the organizational structure of your notebook. Think about back when you were in school and your English teacher made you do an outline for your paper. You kind of need to do that for your notebook before you get started so you have an idea of where you want everything to live. And the reason for that is, like I said, you can't delete anything from Lab Archives. So if you set up a notebook and you realize halfway into your experiment, into your research, that the organizational structure is just not working for you, you're going to have a ton of stuff in the deleted folder, or you're going to have to create a brand new notebook and re-upload everything. And you don't want to do that. So if you take the time before you actually create your notebook to map out that organizational structure, you're going to be a lot happier with your experience with Lab Archives later on. And I'm sure this is what everybody's face is looking like right now, because it was what my face looked like the first time I had to go through all this. I was frustrated and I didn't know what that looked like, and I wanted an example, and there really wasn't an example for me. So I created one for you guys.
Elizabeth, we got a question in the chat real quick. Can the account for or the grant-based notebook move to another institute if the grant PI moves?
Nope.
Oh.
No, you can request a copy of that data, and that has to actually be approved. You would ask me for a copy of the data, and I would have to go through the approval process on campus. And then a copy of that data could go, but the notebook itself does not ever leave our system. So I know it's kind of, once you put it in there, like I said, there's no way for it to go anywhere. So ownership of that notebook cannot be moved to a different institution.
Real quick. Our lab started using Lab Archives in 2020, but our PI didn't create the notebooks. Each lab member created their own notebooks. Is there a way to change ownership to the PI?
There absolutely is. As the individual owner of that notebook, you can change ownership, or you can send me a request and I can actually reassign that notebook to the other person. So that's an easy fix. So if a PI leaves and somebody else comes in and takes over the research here, we have no problems, even if they're already gone. And then we realize, oops, nobody got assigned the notebook. Then I actually have the ability to go into the system and move individual notebooks. So say somebody was a PI and they had 6 notebooks, and we're having 6 different people take over each of those things. I actually can send just one notebook to one person, or I can send everything they had to a single individual. So there are ways to reassign notebooks very quickly. It takes a matter of seconds.
So another question is lab archives mandatory to NIH funded projects?
It is at our campus. As of July 1st, if you have an NIH funded project, you are to use lab archives to store and manage your data. That came out in the daily news and at a really poor time. It came out right after our July 4th holiday. And yeah, and so I think a lot of people kind of missed it, which is one of the reasons that I'm here today and doing this presentation. That mandate has come out of our Department of Research. And it's to help with compliance. It's to make sure that we're doing everything that we're supposed to be doing. And so that we don't have things like research data on somebody's flash drive in their office somewhere that gets lost. We've heard some horror stories from other institutions where, literally an entire lab's research data was on an external hard drive and then it got magnetized. So we don't want that to happen. So this allows, this gives us a secure location for all of that, nothing ever deletes. So we have every version. And, if something is wrong and it was uploaded incorrectly, you can put a note at the top of that page before you delete it. That's, to put it into the deleted items folder. It's not really deleted. That says that this was, mistyped, or, and give an explanation of why you're moving it into that, so that if anybody finds it later, there's a very clear explanation of what happened and why it was moved there. But moving things, changing ownership of notebooks and things like that is easy. Requirements for right now, NIH grants only on this campus are required to use lab archives, but any other grant funded research or even private funded research, it is highly encouraged that you use lab archives. We understand that there are going to be research items that maybe are too large for lab archives, like if you have a ton of photographs as part of your research that are high quality, in-depth photographs. We understand that lab archives may not house those correctly. And in that case, what you do is you put a note in about where those items are housed and how we can access them. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Excellent.
I had a follow-up question about the PI moving.
Mm-hmm.
So typically in our basic sciences, if I'm doing a project on endothelians and glaucoma, let's say I move to University of Florida, there's nobody else who's going to be doing that project. So in that case, is it easy for me to move my lab archives to University of Florida?
Nope. That notebook belongs to the university. Like I said, we can get you a copy of the data.
Okay.
But we can't transfer ownership of a lab archives notebook to someone outside of the system.
And technically, that's the way it works for any data from an NIH funded grant. So the NIH actually holds the university responsible for keeping track of the data.
Okay.
So if you moved, you would make copies and take with you. And
Okay.
basically that's what they're going to do too.
Okay.
Yeah, it's our, I am actually really thankful that we can't, because like like Dr. Gregory said, we would be held responsible. And if we just allowed the transfer, then we have no proof of what happened here, of anything that happened here. And as much as I hate to think about it, people get sick. Tragedies happen, and suddenly if we don't have those backup copies and we're held responsible and something has happened, physically happened to the PI, then we have no way to communicate with NIH about that grant either, and to reconfigure things and find out what we have to do. So that's kind of why this security is that high. We do have different levels of security that the university has selected. That's one of the reasons nothing gets deleted.
Okay.
Technically, the university could choose to allow deletions within it, but we have found for the safety and security of our research data that is a bad idea. We did not want someone to become disgruntled or upset and decide, you know what? No, they're not getting my stuff, and delete everything that they've done.
Okay.
We hope, of course, and we don't expect things like that happen, but by us being proactive and really locking down the information, it keeps that from occurring.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, so everyone, when you guys log in, you guys should have access to the UNT HSC Data Management and Sharing Example Notebook. This is a notebook that I created that has all kinds of things in it for you to use. And one of the things that's inside it is the HSC required folder that is now going to be necessary in every notebook that you create. And the reason that this folder came about after a lot of discussions with Dr. Cunningham and Eric McNair in HSC Next, who's in charge of our intellectual property. And I'm sure Dr. Gladue was involved in some of the back end of the conversations. And then Kayleen Lamb and I from the library, we got together and started talking about what kinds of things would someone who needed to verify that intellectual property was not somehow being put out into the world, if they were looking at a data set or research output that needed a DOI or was ready to be published. And so this is the kind of information that we came up with. It's things that if someone needed to look in and understand the parameters of your grant and the research that you were doing, what kind of information would an expert in your field need to be able to see to understand what you had done and what your requirements were. And so that's how the HSC required folder came into being. There's also a lot of other things in here, like there's example DMP templates that are available for you to where you can look at one of those and pull it up and make your DMP based on those. There's information, there's README files on data storage and collection and analysis. There's some data sharing policy information. There's page structure examples, and all of those examples can be copied to a new notebook direct from here. So there's a lot of really good information within this folder. It is not perfect by any means. And if you all come across something that you're like, you know what, we really need to put this in the campus-wide notebook, please send me information and let me know why you think something needs to be there, and we can absolutely add it. I can edit this at any time. I can't delete anything. So when you go in here, you'll notice there's a deleted items folder and there's stuff in there, because I had stuff and I was like, I don't like this. And so it went to the deleted items folder, just like it will for y'all. I don't have the ability to delete things either, even as the administrator. So when you're in lab archives, how do you create a notebook? What do you do? Well, first of all, you log in, right? Of course, I know that's redundant and all of you understand that, but when I give instructions, I like to start at the very beginning. So you log in. And once you're logged in, on the left-hand side, you'll see your navigation list, and you will select the plus sign next to the search box. Then you're going to name your notebook. So we want you to name your notebook your grant number if you know it. If you are being proactive and you are creating a notebook because you are applying for a grant, and I actually highly recommend that you do this, because a lot of the things that are going to be in that HSC required notebook are actually part of the grant application process. And so you can go ahead and you can temporarily name it, grant application 4. And then when you are given the grant, you can change the name of the notebook. It's a very simple thing. You just right click it and you can change the name. But we want you to name your notebook your grant number, because if, say, Dr. Cunningham needs to know what's going on with that grant and he needs temporary access to your notebook, we're going to know right away which one he needs access to, because you may have a dozen notebooks. Or you can name it your project ID, project name. So there's a couple of examples on the left-hand side here about, things that we'd like to see. We want it to be very clear what's contained in that notebook. So we don't want it to say Smith Lab, and that's all it says, and you to have multiple research projects in a single notebook. We really want every grant to have its own notebook, every research project to have its own notebook. That way, data is not confused and doesn't accidentally get crossed between multiple projects within a notebook. Then you're going to choose your folder layout. Now, when you pick one, if you hit this information button, you get this lovely pop-up box, and it lets you know that if you want no folders in there, you just want it blank and you want to create it from scratch yourself, then you select none. You're going to get a blank notebook. If you need this giant list of folders that show up in lab, or you're going to need most of those, then go ahead and select the lab as your notebook template. Because if you know you're going to have protocols and templates and experimental data and lab meeting notes and outlines of things and manuscripts and published data and all kinds of things, then go ahead and use lab and just delete the folders that you're not using. They'll go into that deleted items folder. If you decide later you need it, you can move it out of the deleted items folder. But please do not use Classroom. And if you have actually a notebook that is set up perfectly because you did it for your last NIH grant and you know you want it exactly the same format, it is perfect for your lab, you are thrilled with it, it is perfection itself, go ahead and select from another notebook and select which notebook it is that is perfect. And it will transfer that template, that format, over into this brand new notebook that you're creating. But most of the time you're going to use none or lab until you've been in Lab Archives enough to where you're comfortable and confident in your notebook setup. And then you're going to click the Create Notebook button and you'll have a notebook, but you're not done, because you need to add that HSC required folder. And in order to do that, inside your notebook, you're going to click on the plus button that's next to the word new on the left-hand side of the notebook to add a folder. You are going to select copy from another notebook, and y'all are going to get a copy. This slide deck will be available in the guide, and of course we're recording this, but you're going to select copy from another notebook. And when you do that, this pop-up box is going to show up. And from the pop-up in this section here that says select location to copy from, you are going to pick the UNT HSC Data Management and Sharing in Lab Archives notebook. Then you are going to click on the HSC required folder, and then you're going to tell it click Start Copy, and that's going to move that folder into your new notebook. So once you do that, I know it's so much, I'm so sorry. This is what it's going to look like. You're either going to, if you selected the lab notebook, you're going to have what's over here on the left. And if you selected none, it's going to look like this. Go ahead, like I said, and delete any unnecessary folders. They will not actually be deleted. They'll go into this deleted items trash can folder and not be deleted permanently from the notebook. And if you selected none or you need additional folders here, you'd use the new button to create new folders, subfolders, documents based on the predetermined organizational structure that you selected. I know that is a lot, and you have to do that every time you set up a new notebook. You'll get the hang of it. I promise. You'll be like, and this, and you're done. But the first couple times it's going to be like, what am I forgetting? And so that's why this slide deck is going to be available on the library guide about lab archives and why I covered it so in depth within this recording. So let's talk a little bit about that HSC required folder. So it's going to include your grant and project information template. Excuse me. That is information that will help others quickly understand your grant or project. Most of this information is actually going to be found in your DMP. I realize that it is going to be redundant for you to input that information, but it puts everything in a single place for us to look at should the need arise. You're going to upload a copy of your data management sharing plan. You can use the form that you submitted with your grant proposal and all adjusted versions. So if midway through your research, you have to make an adjustment to your DMP and that document changes slightly, then you need to upload that version into Lab Archives as well. But you can also choose, there is an NIH DMP widget that is within here that you can choose to use. Any IRB or IACUC documents, which includes all correspondence, approvals, reviews, and progress reports. And we understand these documents may not apply to your research. If they don't, just put a note in there. I do not have these documents for my research. No problem. And then, of course, information on your file naming and set vocabulary that there is actually worksheets and information provided for you within that notebook. So this is what it looks like if you expand that notebook. So here's your notebook. We've named it. Here's your required folder. Inside, you'll see a page that is the HSC grant project information template. And there is a page that is the NIH widget or a page that is a copy of your DMP. You can choose to make a folder that says DMP if you would like to. There's a folder for all IRB and IACUC documents, and within that folder, all the documents from those will be uploaded. There's a folder about file naming. All information on file naming will go into that folder. There's an individual page for you to do your glossary, set vocabulary, or data dictionary. And then you can choose to add additional optional folders to this required folder if you believe that you have any protocols or additional data that will be necessary for DOI approval and intellectual property clearance later on. So if there's something that you're like, you know what, they're not going to be able to understand what we're doing without this one document, it really needs to be in here. Great, put it in there. We're not saying this is all that can be in this folder, but we're saying that everything here that's in this teal color is required. And this all became a requirement on July 1st, but that information was unfortunately not conveyed in the messaging that went out. So if you have questions about individual documents, you are welcome to contact me and we can walk through the process.
So Elizabeth, real quick, we've got two related questions that are about who can access the notebook besides the PI and people in the lab. Can the administration, some kind of administrative person, or who?
So the good news is that initially the only people that will be allowed to access that notebook is the PI and anyone they designate. Later on, should you request a DOI, Eric McNair, who is our intellectual property person, will be given read-only temporary access to your notebook, just where he can look it over. And as soon as he approves that DOI, he no longer has access. So I cannot give someone access to your notebook unless I transfer ownership to them of your notebook. And I would not do that without the PI's permission. So if, say, Dr. Cunningham needs to see your research, or someone in IRB needed to see your research, or someone in, grant compliance needed to see your notebook, you would actually have to provide them access. The PI or the owner of the notebook, or if they have a designated administrator for their notebook, those are the only people that can grant access.
Thank you.
Okay, so a little bit about data management and lab archives. Why do we do it? Well, it's required for research grants. As we know, NIH requires all kinds of things, and there's a lot of funding agencies that actually have data requirements. There's a federal policy regarding open data, and this often requires the creation of a DMP and open publication for federally funded research. You guys all are aware of that. This just makes that burden a little easier. Starting July 1st of 2023, the DRI began requiring NIH-funded investigators to use lab archives to fulfill a requirement in the new NIH data management sharing policy that it took effect way back in January. There were other departments that were government-related, other funding agencies that had these same requirements in the past. But I think that as a campus, so much more of our funding comes from the NIH that it really kind of hit home in January, and we had to take a lot of time to talk about how we were going to manage this and what we could do. And quite frankly, we've had lab archives for years. I mean, I've been here almost 5 years, and I've been the campus administrator the whole time. I used to get about 3 questions a year on lab archives. It wasn't heavily used, and now I'm getting 3 questions a week. So, we've had this tool, and lately we've been able to put a few more things into place with it. So it just made sense to use something we already had and we were already paying for. Now, the library, just to be clear, the library provides education and support, but not oversight for data management. Your data is your responsibility to manage within lab archives. I can give you my best opinion. I can give you tips and tricks. I can tell you what the university is requiring, but I cannot go in there and tell you you're doing it wrong. No one else can. It is up to you to determine how your data needs to be managed within the system. I can help if you have access issues. I can help if somebody can't get access. I can help by setting up training calls, but it is not the library's role to provide oversight for data management. So we have some guides that will actually provide some additional support for you guys. The library has created these tools. We have a guide that is specifically on research data management, which gives you best tips and practices and some things like that. We have a guide on data and statistics, which goes further into management and licensing of data and statistics and explains very clearly what the difference is, because people often confuse the two. Then we have a guide that's specifically on lab archives that I manage. So if there's something else that you guys feel like you need to see in there, please do communicate with me because I can adjust that very quickly. And then we also have a guide on Creative Commons licensing. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because should you request a DOI, it's going to ask you which Creative Commons license you want to attach to your data set. I'll go into that more here in just a moment, but I have found that although we publish extensively on this campus, that not everyone understands the license that they're publishing under. And so while data sets are most often public domain for the individual data set, as long as it hasn't been manipulated into another graph or something like that, the article that you publish, open access is a very broad term, and there are many different licenses which qualify for open access. And so our Creative Commons guide lets you know about what the parameters are on each of those so that when you go to publish, you're more well informed. There's some tools that are provided by the campus, of course, lab archives. If you have inventory that needs to be managed for your lab, we actually now subscribe to lab archives inventory. We just got it a couple of months ago, so that is available for you now as well. REDCap is available for the campus, and it actually has an integration with lab archives. So if you're doing research through REDCap, you can actually transfer that information through an LPI, and it'll just send it right over to Lab Archives. There's a process to that, and that process is clearly explained in the Lab Archives Library Guide. Dataverse, which is coming soon, it's actually going to be called HSC at Fort Worth Data Repository. It is like HSC Scholar is our academic scholarly publishing repository. Dataverse is our data set repository, so that when your data is complete and it is published, we do ask that you give the library a copy of that data to where we can make it available very quickly for others. Dataverse also will give you a place when you're creating your DMP for you to say, you know what, you don't know where you're going to deposit that data. Most people have a very specific place that they normally do. But if you're not sure because you're not quite sure what the outcome's going to be, or you want something more general, you actually can list that you are going to upload your data into our data repository as part of your DMP and be within compliance by just giving us a copy. There's also a DMP tool, of course, that we have a guide about and information about. And then there's some people here on campus. There's me. Like I said, I'm the copyright and OER strategist. I'm in charge of lab archives, copyright publishing, and I can provide information about ORCID and Dataverse as well if you need it. Kayleen Lamb is our librarian. Most of y'all are familiar with her. Kayleen has moved to a part-time position, but she's still answering data management questions. Tom Lyons is our metadata librarian here on campus, and he is going to know more about Dataverse than anybody else on campus. And he's also heading our ORCID initiative and getting that set up. And then Eric McNair is our tech commercialization analyst with HSC Next, and he is your go-to person if you have intellectual property concerns on campus. So
Okay,
let's,
couple quicks. What about multi-PI projects? So if you got 2 PIs on the same grant.
Okay, so what you're going to have to do is determine who the head PI is, and they will create the notebook, and then the other PI needs to be made an administrator on that notebook. And then you'll just need to be very clear on any documentation that's in there within your notebook about why you made that selection, and make sure that people on campus that might need to know that understand whose name it's under. If there's 2 PIs and we need access because they're both gone, then we would already know there were 2 PIs on that, so it would be easy for us to locate it. But a decision does have to be made. One has to own the notebook and one can be an administrator.
And the other question is, Lab Archive sounds like a hard drive in the cloud type of data management system. What's the plan for outages or security threats like ransomware attacks?
Well, the good news is that they actually more than meet the security requirements of our campus. When we enter into new agreements, and we just renewed Lab Archives with adding in the inventory manager piece, they actually had to go through a hard analysis from our IT security people to ensure that they more than meet our standards. Lab Archives is actually FedRAMP certified, which means they meet the national standards for the United States government. So it was extremely intentional, the selection of Lab Archives, because of the security. In 5 years, first of all, Lab Archives is really good about telling you when they're going to be down for a short period of times for updates. And so that's wonderful. But in the 5 years I've been doing this, it has never been down for more than an hour.
Wow.
Yeah, they're extremely diligent and careful, and they are always updating their security to meet government standards, because if they, the United States government uses Lab Archives to store data. So they, they know where their bread is buttered, and they make sure that their security is extremely tight. Now, that being said, if you are uploading data that has to do with people, please redact information. There are certain pieces, and y'all should know what those are, that should only be managed in a very specific way. And I am not the expert in that. So if there are questions about the privacy issues or things like that, and whether or not a piece of information should be uploaded, then you need to work with the grants office and with compliance and with IRB and IACUC and people like that on campus to make that determination. And then if they have determined that that information is too sensitive to be uploaded into this system, then what you do is you put a note in there that sensitive information was not uploaded into Lab Archives, and it is held wherever it is held.
Okay. One more question about the ownership. So what if you have PIs from different institutions?
who is the main PI.
Okay, so can they designate just like they do if the person is on campus?
So here's the thing. So for, say, our researcher is the main PI, but they need someone from LSU who is their other PI, or somebody who's working on this project. They can have a free Lab Archives account if their university does not, and they can be made a user in our system and be able to upload things and read things. They just can't download anything, and they can't take anything with them.
Yeah.
But you can actually bring in people from outside of HSC as a user in Lab Archives within your lab. It does not have to be an HSC member. Matter of fact, one of our researchers on campus, it's been a couple years ago now, but they were collecting some anonymous data about from some of our elementary schools. And they needed like the school nurse at the elementary school to be able to access and upload the documents for them. No problem. We walked them through creating their free Lab Archives account. They were invited to the notebook as a guest. That's what that, because they were only temporary. So they got 60-day guest access where they could upload things. And then after 60 days, they no longer could see the notebook and they were no longer part of it. So if it's someone who's going to be temporary, and I'll cover, a lot of this is in this next section, but if it's someone that's going to be temporary, you give them guest access and determine whether they need to be able to upload things or just read things. And if they're going to be more permanent people, then you make them users. We don't recommend, unless they are an additional PI, that they are made administrators. Because administrators have almost all the power that the owner does. And that means they can invite other people to the notebook. And I'm not sure, you want to be real careful about who has the ability to do that.
Gotcha, thanks.
So again, let's talk a little bit about users and what those titles mean. So owners can edit and clone an entire notebook, which means if, like I said, if it's perfect this time and you've got a new grant project that's going to run similarly, you can clone the whole thing and give it a new name and you're good to go. An owner controls who has access to all the data in Lab Archives. There can only be one designated person for this role, which I know is frustrating when you have multiple PIs. But that person is usually the PI or the project or lab manager. We ask that it is always the PI if at all possible. The administrator is another role, and they have the same rights as the owner, but they cannot delete or clone a notebook. Now, no one can delete a notebook. We don't allow that, but they can't copy a notebook over to somebody else. Then you have users, excuse me, and they can be given edit or view only rights. A user cannot share a notebook with anybody. So if you make someone a user and they're like, you know what, I really need Billy from the lab to be able to access this, they have to ask the administrator or the owner of the notebook to send Billy that invitation. That user cannot do it. And then guests have edit, it says edit rights for 60 days. They can only be given viewable rights also, but after 60 days, guest access will become read only, and you can eliminate them from the notebook. You can just turn them off. So please remember, once again, HSC does not allow the deletion of content from Lab Archives. I have to say this a lot. So this chart, excuse me a minute, let me just grab a drink. This chart is on the library's guide because you can see, you notice I've got some things redlined because we don't allow for deletion. So this lets you know what each type of user can do. And this chart, I believe I have also put in the required notebook as information for you so that when you go to make your list of everyone who's going to have access to things, you can very easily determine what type of usage rights they should have. Adding users to Notebook is super easy. It all happens in Lab Archives. You click your name and it brings up the drop-down menu and you select Manage My Account, and this opens a new window. So it's going to default. Users should be automatically selected. On the right, you'll see the person icon right here with the plus sign next to it. You click on that. That brings up this pop-up box, and you add the email addresses for everyone that you want to be given a specific role. So if you have 2 people that you want to be administrators because it's your other PI and your lab manager, great. You put their emails in, you tell it what role you want them to have. They're going to be administrators. And then you click the notebook you want them to have all access to. And you click add user. And that sends them an email that invites them to the notebook. If they do not get it, then you need to verify their email address with them. Now you can go further. You can add users to a specific folder or even a specific page in the notebook. So you don't have to give people access to your entire notebook. If you have a folder that is called Experiment 3 and there are 4 people working on Experiment 3 and they don't need to see Experiment 1, 2, or 4, you only want them to have access to that folder, you can give them access to only that folder. And by doing that, you log into Lab Archives. You right-click on whatever folder it is that you want or page that you want to give them access to. That brings up this menu that's on the screen. You click the share button, which is right here with this little icon. That opens an additional pop-up box. That's what the box looks like. You select the Invite People tab. We go through the same process we just went to. You enter the email address for everybody that you want to use it. You can use this drop down here of people that already have access to other notebooks that you have granted. And then you just determine whether you want them to be able to only view it or to edit because they'll be uploading things. You put in a subject and a message for the email, and you hit send, and they'll get their invitation to just that folder, and they will not have access to any of the rest of your notebook. You can go further even. You can add users to only a section of a page within a notebook. So if you have a colleague that you need to only view a spreadsheet that you have uploaded with data, well, you don't want to email that spreadsheet because of security reasons. So you can actually go to the page within the notebook, and you're going to hover over the top section, and it'll bring up this taskbar. And you're going to click that share icon, just like we saw at the others. And a box will pop up that's identical to the 2 that we've already seen. You put in their email address, you tell what role they want, you send them the email. And it's as simple as that to add people to very specific parts of your notebook, the entire notebook, or, individual minutia, tiny little pieces. So, is there any more questions about user type and what we can do with that before we go on to DOIs and research sharing? I'm going to take the silence as a no. Okay, so researchers here at HSC have access to free digital object identifier features in Lab Archives. A growing number of funding agencies require grant recipients to present data management plan and share portions of their research data publicly. So the DOI tool is an easy way to help with compliance on that. DOIs are permanently indexed, and unlike URLs, they don't change or disappear. So the way this would happen inside, step 1 and 2 are not depicted in this image, but inside your notebook, you right click on any folder or page to bring up the menu of option. This is going to be the place where your data that you want a DOI assigned to is stored. So if it is a specific section of a page, you're going to do like you invited people, you're going to do the same process, but you're going to request a DOI. You click the share to open the pop-up box, just like we did with people. And then instead of this invite people section over here, you're going to move over to this publish data section. You're going to select this entry as it exists now under the links to option. And there's a reason for that. If your data changes, because you have additional research data or whatever, but you have already requested a DOI for a data set, you must request a new DOI for any altered version of that data set, because we review those individually. And so it's always as the entry as it exists now at the moment that you are making the request. Then you're going to select your Creative Commons license. I'll go over what licenses we have made available. You're going to add all author names and ORCID. Every single author that should get credit for that data set needs to be listed. You cannot do it for a single person if there were 5 people involved, and everyone needs to include their ORCID, and the PI does need to be designated by the little checkbox. Then you're going to give your data set a title. You're going to add your DMP and grant funding ID. And then you're going to click request permission to publish. What happens then is that Dr. Cunningham and Eric McNair get an email that lets them know that someone has requested a DOI. Eric then evaluates the data set in question based on the information in the HSC required folder. That's the folder he's going to look at. That's why it's so important that that information is in there. He's not going to go digging through the rest of your research if it is not 100% necessary. And then he will make a determination of whether or not there is any intellectual property concerns with that data set. If there are none, he's going to go, great, congratulations, here's your DOI. If there are, he will decline it, and he will send you an email letting you know that you need to resubmit under a different license because of X, Y, and Z concerns about intellectual property. And then y'all can have a conversation about what that means and why you think he's right or he's wrong. And then you guys can hash it out before you resubmit for a new DOI. So right now, we have limited, as a university, the decision was made to limit it to 3 licenses available only. There are lots of additional Creative Commons licenses, but we thought that these 3 would 9,900,000 times would meet our criteria. Every once in a while, we're going to get something that we're going to need to reevaluate. And when that happens, Eric McNair will contact me, and I will make a change to the system that will allow for something else for a short period of time. So like I said, most of your data sets are going to be in the public domain, which is a CC0 public domain license. It is used for raw or unstructured data sets. Others can use these for any purposes. Many grants or journals require this designation when publishing. So just be aware of that. The CC-BY or attribution license is used for any data that has been manipulated for expression. So if you want a chart that you created to have a DOI, or a specific graph that you have manipulated that data for a specific expression, then you can choose that license rather than a public domain, because there's an artistic element to it or a design element to it, and it's not just a raw data set. But again, people will be able to use it freely as long as they give you credit for it. If there are any intellectual property concerns at all, we're going to ask that you use the CC-BY-NC, which is an attribution non-commercial license. That's used for data that has been manipulated for expression, but that may have some intellectual property pieces involved. Others can use these for any non-commercial purposes as long as they cite you in the license. So we just want to make sure that nobody's going to make money off of things that they shouldn't. But these are the only 3 that you're allowed to select within Lab Archives. We tried to make it as easy as possible for you. And if you have questions about what license you should use, you are welcome to contact me, and I can give you an opinion on what I think your data set constitutes, whether I think it's an expression or whether I consider it a raw data set, if you would like to grant me temporary access to that data set so I can take a look at it. Okay, really quickly, let's talk a little bit about research sharing. And I want you guys to think about, where does your research data live? Because right now the answer is not for everybody in lab archives. I think it's going to almost end up that everyone's data for basically everything on campus eventually ends up in lab archives. But right now it may be other places. So it may be in REDCap. REDCap does have an API interface that allows you to send that information to your lab archives notebook. It may be in OneDrive. We ask that if it is, to please upload that data into lab archives and then delete it off of OneDrive, because lab archives is more secure than our OneDrive. It should live in lab archives. It will live in whatever repository is designated in your DMP upon completion of your data. Your data sets must be uploaded by mandates of your grant into whatever repository you listed in your DMP. We ask that you then also, if HSC at Fort Worth Data Repository, lovingly known as Dataverse, is not listed on your DMP, we do ask that you provide us with a copy of that data set to be deposited in the institution's data repository. And then we're also asking you to send to HSC Scholar, our academic repository, any relevant publications that are attached to that data set, so that we have a complete record of the research work and output that is happening on this campus. It allows us to provide additional information to departments when they want to know things. It allows us to talk to different people on campus about who's publishing open access. We have a better idea of where our people are publishing when this happens, so that the library can enter into agreements that will help save you money on publication costs. So your research data may live in a lot of places, but where it should live is within lab archives and within repositories. And so we want you to think about where it is that you're currently storing things, and reconsider and then follow new mandates if you have NIH grants. So there are a couple of suggested trainings, and I realize that you guys cannot click on these links, but these trainings are actually listed in the guide that I have created around lab archives. It's on the library website. And if you just Google lab archives trainings, these come up. The North America Introduction to Lab Archives Research Edition, which is what we have, is given like every 2 weeks. It is online, and they go through a lot of little things that I did not have time to talk about today. And then if you plan on using Lab Archives Inventory, because I'm going to be really honest, I do not have the knowledge set for Lab Archives Inventory, because that's not something I can really play with. I don't have inventory. But they have a really good introduction to that program that you can take online. It's also given like every 2 weeks. So I know that was a lot, you guys. Do you have any additional questions for me?
Dr. Krishnamurthy does.
Yeah, let me. I was listening to this different types of data, and I thought, when we work in the lab, we get data that's good, bad, and ugly. We get sometimes dirty blots, sometimes our negative control doesn't work, positive control. So I guess we just upload the really meaningful data. And then you mentioned about CC-BY license and that CC-BY-NC, Who makes the determination? Is it the PI, or is it Bob McLean's office? Who makes that determination?
Actually, you do. As the PI, when you request the DOI, you tell them which license you believe that falls under. If there are no intellectual property concerns, then they're going to go with the license you say it should have.
Oh, okay.
If there are intellectual property concerns, that would be the only time that Eric McNair would go, we need to talk about this, because here's where I see an intellectual property concern. And then he would push you to that non-commercial license. If it's flat out, we have an intellectual property giant red flag, that is a different conversation that you have. And normally you would know that based on the type of funding that you have. Normally, you're not going to have major intellectual property concerns with NIH funded, but it happens. I've learned never to say never when it comes to intellectual property. And because he's the expert on that, he's the one that handles those conversations. But you as the PI, you are the one that selects which data sets get a DOI and which license you want them licensed under. Because no one knows your data better than you do. And as far as what you upload, my suggestion is you upload all the data, even if it's garbage, upload it and put a note with that data set that says, this was not handled correctly. This has a problem because of this. This has this. We had to rerun the experiment. Whatever it is that you need to say about that piece, put it in there. That way, if anyone ever questions, well, why did you do this? Why did this happen? This can't possibly be the only data set that was collected from all of this research. You have everything in one location with notes that happen at the time of upload so that you can answer those questions 5 years from now. If someone has a question when you're like, I barely remember doing that research. Like we've moved on to 3 other things now. I don't remember everything that happened in that lab, especially if more people than you will be uploading information into lab archives. It's really important that they include those notes when they upload things, because if they don't, you just have some random data set that doesn't mean anything to anybody. And that's where we have problems down the line when, no one wants Dr. Gladue to contact me and go, hey, so these people left and I need access to all of their notebooks because we've had some questions occur. And it has happened. I about once a year I get the phone call, and it's not a phone call that I like getting. I don't want Dr. Gladue to call me and ask for access to notebooks because it's never a yay, this person has left, but this person's taking over and yay. Because if he wants that to happen, I am told to transfer it to the new person. There's always some sort of question that has to be answered when he asks for access. And so it's better for everyone involved if all of those notes and all data is uploaded at the time that the research happens, good, bad, or ugly. And then you request the DOI on the good data and move on from there.
That's good advice. Thank you.
Any other questions? One just popped up in the chat. Is there an APP associated with Lab Archive for upload note data by phone? An app?
Is there an app associated with Lab Archives? There is not. And I know that's frustrating, but I believe it has to do with security. Because people, if you have an app, then so they have not developed that. I can absolutely reach out to our Lab Archives people and see if that's something that they are investigating, that it's something that we have requested. I don't know that their answer will be yes, but I can absolutely find out. But right now there's not.
Anybody else? Well, I will tell you this, Elizabeth. I think you got the most questions of anybody who has given a talk.
Well, I'm glad. I like answering questions, and I've been in this system, like I said, for almost 5 years now. And it wasn't being used. And, it's a really handy system. Everyone in your lab can have access to the same information or limited information based on their role, which I think is absolutely amazing because as we know, as supervisors and administrators, we know that sometimes there's information that not everybody needs to know, and there's information that not everybody needs to have access to. And I like that Lab Archives allows us to pick and choose and yet share responsibilities. So if your administrative assistant is going to be the one uploading most of the data for you, because we all know you're crazy busy, you can make your admin an administrator or a user, and they can upload things for you if they have the rights to see that data. They just can't own that notebook.
So we do have one other question about, currently data in my lab stored on HSC control servers.
Mhm.
To move it to lab archives.
If it is an NIH grant, we do ask that you move it to lab archives. We're not saying you have to remove all copies from the server, but the more we utilize lab archives, the more server space we free up. And that is a good thing. Now, like I said, we know that there are things like sometimes images, lab archives will not hold. If your image is really large, sometimes it won't hold it. And we have no choice but to put that on the server. And that's when you put that note in going, 452 images of XYZ were too large to store in lab archives. They are on this server currently housed at HSC. Access can be granted by request. Those sorts of things, because we know that some of our data sets can be extremely large. And while lab archives is very meaty and it will hold a lot, it won't hold everything. And it's normally images that cause quirks and need some outside storage. And yes, I can absolutely give everyone access to this PowerPoint presentation. I know that's much easier than watching through a whole recording to find the one piece that you need. I will be posting it on the Lab Archives guide, but I don't know how to distribute it best, but Dr. Gregory, I can send it to you if there's a way for us to add it to wherever we upload the videos.
Or to Meredith. I'd send
Or to
it
Meredith?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep, send it on over. We'll get it uploaded for you.
excellent.
Thanks, everybody. This was a great, like 35 people on, lots of questions. I'm sure we don't know all the answers, so we're probably going to have a follow-up at some point.
And I am available if you guys, if you just want to schedule a Q&A session where people can just throw questions at me, or, have me pull up Lab Archives and go, well, here's how I do it. I have no problem doing that for you.
Awesome. Thanks, Elizabeth. Really
Thank
great
Thank
job.
you.
Very
Appreciate
helpful.
you.
Appreciate
All
it.
right. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
That was good. Very helpful.
Yeah.
Very nice.